What's up guys, this is ScherBR talking. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'll be doing something different. We'll discuss how the meta changed for how we grind in this game. I did a video talking about how the hard boss fights changed, and I want to talk about how the grind changed since the launch of the game. Actually changed by quite a lot. I was watching my old videos to try to understand how my videos worked back then, and now. I was very surprised. Well, it all started with Sophia. Yes, original Sophia that you can get just by starting the game. She was actually necessary to survive when grinding, because enemies were just using Feral Claw and very powerful attacks that could one-shot your best damage dealers. So you could never think about soloing, even killing the enemies in one turn. So Sophia needed to be there to revive your damage dealers so that they could keep killing the enemies. Sophia was needed for quite a lot of time. Eventually the enemies started doing more and more damage, and our second good healer was Princess Whiterose, and the second best way to clear content was to just bring 2 healers and 3 damage dealers. So if they died, they could be revived, so you could keep farming. Yeah, and by this time we also got a version of Asalus that was kind of one of the few characters that was capable of soloing some very specific stage because of use of maybe Whirlwind and then Mirage Step. Yeah, Asalus could kill some waves, especially about very weak enemies, but it was not common. But it was the first glimpse of things to come, having access to cheap AoE attacks. That was already present with Princess Whiterose Chocoball in her Valentine style. You could just use it, and we saw the release of other mages like Undine that had her teacher style and has access to ice javelins. So cheap AoEs were starting to become more preeminent and allowed you to kill waves with plenty of enemies. It was around this time as well where we could use a very interesting setup with Rouge. Yeah, that Rouge that you needed to farm in the start of the game. He has this skill called Drain Energy. I remember a stage where you had to fight versus Witch's Daughter, and well, Rouge just could not die. He could just be using Drain Energy, and you could bring 4 trainees. This was also a glimpse of things to come. After Rouge and this strategy, we saw the release of Bart. This was the first fast attacker in the game, and he kind of changed quite a lot of how we farm, because we had very powerful attacks that just could not be used on turn 1, and you could not define if a character was going before another. So Barthélemy having access to Abaddon Hands allowed him to always go first, and you could save your best attacks for the second wave. Abaddon Hands was strong enough back then that he could kill all the enemies by himself and still help with Hit Wind on the next wave. This was made for farming, mostly events, because he cannot use Hit Wind again on the third wave. But even then, we still used Barthélemy for story farming because we could just use strong attacks on the second turn. It was back then when we start seeing things like, you remember about this? The first Gustave had access to this skill called Will Swing. Remember that it was just B power? Yeah, back then it was not that strong. Eventually got amplified to an S power skill, and we could finally use that on turn 2 without having to rely on RNG. After Bart, we also start using characters with access to skills that had double hits. I remember being able to use this with this version of Gustave for stages with just 1 enemy, but also Katarina, that was actually released before, and she had access to the same skill. Double Crush was very nice to farm stages with just 1 enemy. After this time of using this type of skills, especially for events with just 1 enemy as well, we saw the release of the first Galahad. Yeah, the free Galahad was capable of almost soloing as well. With this Chilly Breeze and Winter Storm combo, you only needed a secondary damage dealer to help sometimes. Galahad was very useful for around 3 to 4 months, I guess. And after Galahad trying to, well, solo content by himself, but still failing to do so, we saw the release of this platinum style of Albert, called Rewards of the Tribes. He came with this skill called Victor's Blade, 6 BP for an AoE attack that could instant kill. But there was a problem. His intelligence was very low. but some very specific enemies could be instant killed without help. If you needed help, you could bring characters that will debuff Will. But still, this Albert could only instant kill 2 times, because he didn't have enough BP. But 2 to 3 months later, they released another version called Beer the Light of Hope. By having access to 2 points of BP extra on start, he was capable of using Victor's Blade 3 times in a row to solo story stages, and he worked in many different stages. I believe that Albert was the big impact that started to bring the new meta of trying to use only one character to grind and bring 4 trainees. This was actually the best way to grind, and it still is, because there are way too many characters to train, and we like to train as much characters as possible. And Albert still works here and there, but eventually they just didn't want Albert to work so well because he is free, everyone could use him, and they wanted to sell stronger farmers. We saw the biggest impact the game has ever had. That was when Rufus was released, alongside all the Saga Frontier 1 crew. He had access to Gun and Blade to farm events with just one boss. It was just game breaking. You could just kill a boss with Gun and Blade sometimes. Eventually you needed a second damage dealer, but Rufus was just too powerful. Not just that, he could also use submachine gun twice. He could be paired up easily with Fuse, that will also buff back and forth with 2 styles, with access to submachine gun from Inheritance. So they were just dominating the stages that were weak to blunt. It was not just that, because they also released it alongside a media that had access to AoEs as well, with Ricochet Parade, Total Shot, and sometimes Bullet Dance for single targets. It was also back then when we saw the release of Red, with his amazing Punish combo skill. I remember using this in some stages where we had small minions in a central boss, and Red just killed it all. It was just so fun to use this because it allowed us to strategize better. So it was the part of the game where we dominated farming with blunt damage. They were just on top of the game. After then, we got the release of Joe. That was also game changing. Joe, much like Bart, has access to an AoE attack that this time it was powerful with beat damage and carried 2 elements, that being heat and cold, so it covered lots of ground. And she can also be paired up with Bertrand, and sometimes with just those 2 combined we could duo some stages with not much difficulty. She was also used to increase the damage potential of other people in the party. She stayed in the meta for quite a lot of time, and it was also after Joe that we saw the release of Global X banners with Impress and Emperor. I remember Impress being strong for a single target because of Quadruple Moon Strike, but only after someone attacked before her. But you also had access to Emperor, that had that AoE cycle in his Global X style of opening with Imperial's Word and then Sun Flash. Around this time, but a little later, we could combo Leon, that was released on the same Global X banner, with UDX Matriarch, and you could combo Leon and Matriarch for very strong sun damage that worked both in events and in story farming. After some time, we saw the release of Christmas Urpina. She also had a cycle very similar to the likes of Global X Final Emperor, and with access to a stronger attack that was also fast. She kind of replaced Joe in most setups, but she could still be used together. And Barrage Blade Plus was very strong back then. You could pair up Urpina later with someone like Rick that had access to a similar attack, but this time it was Slash and Heat, and he could also use the same attack for Inheritance, Mirage Blade Plus, 2 times to kill some waves of enemies in events. It was also around this time that we saw the release of Human Forneus, that had access to a skill by Inheritance called Spinning Trample. With 8 PP cost and C power, very close to B, he was capable of soloing some events, but it was not that common, but he was there, and if he could not solo, it was easy to pair up someone with Forneus to just allow for lots of trainees. Around the time that Forneus got released, there was also Saruin UDX style. He had access to an 8 power attack with only 7 BB cost. That is just amazing and a sign of how Powercreep will change in the future. You could pair them up together or just Saruin and Arpina, Saruin and Rick, and they would dominate the farming setups for quite some time. After 4 News, we saw the release of Bertrand. In his UDX style, he was capable of solo farming, some stages by use of Twilight Fall, that in global can also instant queue, and we could also solo some events with Claudia. That is, those conquest events where she could just use that Assassin Zero with this version. Well, Assassin Zero could be inherited from her tower style, so we live it era of single target instant queue. It was pretty nice back then. Bertrand would eventually get a second style that will also allow him to solo other content with Frost Quake. That was a stronger AoE attack. Well, it worked for not much time, to be honest. After Bertrand, we saw the release of UDX Gustave. That was very, very strong by his time. They changed it Triple Crush to use it on turn 1. And this was very strong versus events with just one enemy. Gustave was finally contesting Rufus. Still not as strong as Rufus, but pretty close. Gustave was another one alongside Rook that was also presenting very strong damage on turn 1 with his access to Hammer Roll, a skill that would just hit twice. It had recoil damage, but the second hit would do insane amounts of damage because of passives. After those two, we saw the release of Katarina's Summer style and had access to Waterfall Blade Plus. She herself didn't have enough BP to use it 3 times in a row, but she was released alongside Welfare style that was actually pretty fun. She had access to more BP, could just use it 3 times in a row, and could also use another skill that was actually based on roll damage from the Summer style. So this was helpful, and it still is. Waterfall Blade is one of the best skills for farming up till now. And after Waterfall Blade Plus, we saw the release of Alosis in Metroid 4 banner. And Alosis was yet another style that could solo story stages and even some events with access to Grand Trample. When he kills enemies, he recovers VP and he had very high damage potential. As for Alosis, his reign didn't last for too long because we saw the release of Arthur. There was the definite AoE solo farmer for quite some time. With access to Infinite Trajectory, that is a fast attack with 8 power, and a chase with just B damage, he was just very strong for the time and could just land, slash, blunt and hit damage, work it in many different stages, even events. Arthur was the big change in how we farmed the game. I remember that a little bit after Arthur, we also saw the release of the Robin family. And Robin family was just so fun because Joe had access to this skill called Sparkly Nice that could be used to just do insane amounts of damage. Like Rufus, she gets paralyzed and was very strong to farm events with just one enemy. Around that time, we got the release of SaGa Soul styles like Krienhild that worked pretty nicely with her Light of Blue Quartz to kill 2 waves, almost always. We started getting stronger weapons. The forged weapons were released along her release, and there was also So-cho around that time that also had access to Waterfall Blade Plus by inheritance, and man, his damage was very high, also being capable of soloing content. There was also So-cho back then, could also use Missile 3 times in a row to solo some story stages. A little bit after these banners, we saw the release of Leon that changed how we farm bosses again, because he had a triple S attack and followed up with a D power attack, so damage was pretty high. He paired up with Rufus was enough to solo many events in, I don't know, maybe 6 months, and even now sometimes we can use those two together for very nice results. Around that time we also got access to bigger column damage with Gustave, column attack, call it Vertical Blade. And besides Gustave, in the same banner we saw the release of Darkin, that had access to a column attack with double elements. Those two were capable of soloing some events for a while. And with the release of those two characters, we finally saw how they wanted to sell us characters that could do big damage for row or column. And we got Sparrow, with access to Izuna, and also recovering BP after killing. Much like Human Alosis, he became a meta character that could farm both story and events with ease. Well, Sparrow was just the start of something greater. We were starting to see characters that could just solo farm with access to similar attacks, like eventually Leonard with Lion Dash, and much later the release of Summer Gustav that had access to this other attack called Rising Blaze, much like also Summer Blue with access to Shined Sunbeam. Very strong attackers that can solo many content. After those, we saw the release of a contender for Lian, at least on farming and even on boss fights. Silver was released with her Global Axe style, then eventually her UDX style. Both are very strong for farming boss fights. With access to multiple element damage and multi-hit attacks, you just use it Silver, and you still do. She is and was game-changing. I remember that after Silver, we got another very powerful character with Albert, latest style, that we still use it. With access to Left Fork, an attack with 5 hits that buffs STR with each hit, Albert can solo some content. Both story, he was able to solo some events as well, and is still a big player when grinding. After Albert, we saw the release of a very powerful character that didn't have access to use, King Sei, another capable of soloing with both slash and blunt cycles. His reign didn't last for too long because I believe characters with row and column attacks are easier to use than King Sei. A little after King Sei, there was also the summer version of Coppelia that has 2 different cycles for column and row. Alongside Coppelia, it was also the release of the second Summer Liza that could inherit this attack called Wave Rush and attack 3 times in a row if the enemy was weak to cold. She is also capable of soloing content with much ease. Back then we had to wait a little to see other farmers with big potential, but recently we got someone named Galahad. Yeah, he returned, now bowed and with a very big ice cream as a sword, and he can solo a lot of different content by himself. People think that he's a joke character, he may be, but he is still one of the best characters in this game. So I guess the video will end here. I hope this was fun for you. I was just checking out in so many different characters that got released in this game and how the grinding changed. In the start, we needed to revive our characters because they were just dying. To reach a point where we could just use stronger attacks in the second turn because of the introduction of fast attacks, to reach a point where only one character was capable of soloing grind, and you could train 4 units without doing anything. And this became a staple in this game. We always want to try to solo, even when not possible. We try, right? Because it's just too many characters to train, so the fast way is always the best. So, tell me your memories of grinding and the characters that you use the most here on the comment section. Thank you so much. I hope to see you soon in the next video or the next live stream. Bye!